In this video, we are going to be looking at the costs of inflation. All right, so there are several costs of inflation, four that we're going to look at. I'm not sure if we're going to get through all four in one video. We'll see how we do on time, but let us go ahead and get started. So first, we're just going to write down what these different costs are, and then we will go through them one by one. All right, so the first one, the first cost of inflation is price confusion and money illusion. The second is that inflation redistributes wealth. Three, inflation interacts with taxes. And four, inflation is painful to stop. All right, so these are our four costs of inflation. I'm going to just kind of run through those once again while you guys get to copy these down. All right, so price confusion and money illusion. Inflation redistributes wealth. Inflation interacts with taxes. And inflation is painful to stop. All right. So we'll start, obviously, with the first one, price confusion and money illusion. All right, so as we at least briefly discussed when we were talking about price ceilings and price floors, prices act as signals, right? They signal the value, all right, the relative value of goods and services to consumers and producers alike. However, inflation distorts those signals, right? If we actually have inflation where the price levels are going up, then it's going to make the prices of these goods higher. It's going to make it look like they are more valuable than perhaps they are, right? So when prices increase, due to inflation, producers may interpret this as an increase in demand. All right, so producers see that prices are going up. They assume that prices are going up because there's increased competition between consumers to get this good, all right? So kind of a change in demand, right? It's either, for whatever reason, it's become more popular, kind of that tastes and preferences, or consumer incomes maybe have risen, right? That's probably what this producer is thinking, right? Not that, well, we just have inflation, because you're not going to know that when it starts happening. So what does this producer do? Well, one, they think they're going to get a higher price for this good, so they might make more. Some other producers might return or jump into this market because they want to take advantage of those profits, right? So they're going to increase their quantity supplied despite the fact that no more of the good was being demanded, right? Demand didn't actually change. It just maybe looked like it did because of inflation. Right? So producers create all of these extra units of the good, even though nobody wants it, and they're kind of just wasting resources, right? They're not using them effectively. All right, this is an example of price confusion. All right, so again, kind of misinterpreting, right, this increase in price due to inflation as an increase in price due to an increase in demand, right? Increasing their quantity supplied, right? When in fact the demand did not change, right? And so you're wasting those resources. All right, so that is price confusion. The next one we have the next thing in this category is money illusion. All right, so money illusion is when we are mistaking changes in nominal prices for changes in real prices. All right, so this is the classic old person, this used to cost 5 cents in my day, right? I could go to the movies, get a hamburger and a drink, get, you know, a Rolls Royce and a Rolex watch, all for a nickel, right? And saying things, you know, everything has, you know, the price has increased on everything. When that's not necessarily the case. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if you're just comparing the two nominal prices from different years, you're not going to know which one, in which time period it was more expensive, right? That's going to be based on the real price, right? If you can compare the real prices, and I would imagine, and I haven't checked on this, but I imagine a lot of stuff was actually a lot more expensive in terms of real prices back in the day, for, you know, multiple reasons. Probably the biggest one is trade now. We have trade to a much greater extent than they did back then. All right, but this money illusion can make consumers think that a good is kind of more valuable than it actually is, and refrain from purchasing it and consuming it, even though its real price was the same before inflation, right? And so again, we kind of see some missed opportunities when we have money illusion. All right, the next one is the fact that inflation redistributes wealth. All right, so inflation transfers real resources between borrowers and lenders. So we're going to look at a couple of different things and kind of develop an idea about this. All right, so we're going to start with an equation. So this first equation, all right, this is R subscript real. This is the real interest rate. All right, so this is the amount, the interest paid at the end of the day by the borrower and what is received by the lender. All right, I is the nominal interest rate. Right, so this is the interest rate that's kind of on the paper, that's on the sign or the little pamphlets they mail you saying, hey, well, you can get a loan for this percentage, right? That's the nominal rate. And then, of course, pi is the inflation rate. So the real inflation, or the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Right, so that we're gonna let that sit there for a second, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about what's known as the Fisher effect. So the Fisher effect is the tendency of nominal interest rates to rise with expected inflation. All right. So in other words, if lenders expect the inflation rate to be increasing in the future, right, they don't want that higher inflation to eat into the interest they can get. All right, so if they expect inflation to be going up and going up, they're going to set higher and higher nominal rates to compensate for that. All right, so they actually get the real rate that they want. All right, and we can represent that with another equation. All right, so the nominal interest rate equals the expected inflation rate plus the equilibrium interest rate. Right, so they're saying, you know, hey, this is the interest rate I actually want to receive, right, at the end of the day. This is how much I think inflation, how much inflation is going to happen, right? And so to get my nominal rate, I'm going to add those two together, right? Because at the end, if I was correct and my expected inflation rate and the actual inflation rate are equal, then I'm going to get that equilibrium rate, right? You're going to pay me the equilibrium rate, and I'm going to receive the equilibrium rate. All right, now we're going to take equations 1 and equation 2. We're going to combine and slightly rearrange them. And that is going to give us equation 3. Right? The real interest rate is equal to the expected inflation rate minus the actual inflation rate plus the equilibrium interest rate. All right, so why is this important? The reason this is important is because this is going to show us how wealth is redistributed. All right, so as we said, if the expected inflation rate is equal to the actual inflation rate, right, then we're going to get 0 for this term in the blocky brackets, right, in the brackets. All right, so if the expected value of the inflation rate is equal to the inflation rate, then the real interest rate is equal to the equilibrium inflation rate. Or excuse me, equilibrium interest rate. So the real interest rate equals the equilibrium interest rate. All right, so if the predictions about inflation are correct, then the lender is going to receive that equilibrium rate and the borrower is going to pay that equilibrium rate as the real rate. All right, so that's kind of the best case scenario. All right, nothing gets moved around in a way that people weren't expecting. All right, what does change things is that when the expected value of the inflation rate is greater than the actual inflation rate, then this is going to be positive, right? This term in the brackets is going to be positive. All right, so that means if the equilibrium rate plus something else is equal to the real interest rate, that must mean that the real interest rate is greater, right? Because the equilibrium had to add something to it. So in this case, the real rate is greater than the equilibrium rate. Right? And wealth is redistributed from borrowers to lenders. Right? Because now the real rate that the consumer is actually paying, the borrower is paying, right? That's greater than that equilibrium rate, right? Kind of the rate that they kind of thought they were agreeing to at the beginning, right? So the borrower is paying more than they thought they would be, right? And the lender is receiving more than they thought they would be. All right, so that is where we see that wealth redistribution. All right, of course, there is another scenario, right, which is when the expected value of the inflation rate is less than the actual inflation rate, or in other words, people underestimated how much inflation there would be, right? It was higher than expected, right? Then in that case, that term in our blocks, the expected inflation rate minus the actual inflation rate, that is going to be a negative number, right? And so that would mean that the real interest rate is less than the equilibrium interest rate, right? And wealth is redistributed from lenders to borrowers. All right, so why is this a big deal? All right, well, this last one is really the main reason why this is a big deal. That's the reason we did this last. All right, so if we think about who has the ability to cause inflation, all right? Well, we know that usually inflation is caused by increases in the money supply, all right? So who can increase the money supply? Right? In most cases, it's the government, right? The government, whatever government you're talking about, they are the ones that issue money, all right? Additionally, governments are often borrowers. So governments are often buyers, and they also have the ability to increase the money supply and thereby the inflation rate. Right, and kind of governments borrow from each other, but they also borrow from their citizens. Right, things like stocks and bonds, really a lot of stuff. Or really, it's mostly stocks and bonds, I imagine. But so if a government wanted to, right, then they could just print off a bunch of money, right, and use that to pay off their debts, right? That would certainly transfer wealth from the lender to the borrower, right? If the government takes out a loan, then they just print off a bunch more money, right? Pay the loan with that, right? One, that's definitely going to increase the inflation rate if you're paying off a government-sized loan with freshly kind of printed money. And that's going to affect both kind of the citizens, all right, individuals, and also other governments. All right, this is what's known as monetizing the debt. All right, so this is when governments pay off debt by printing more money. Right, not a whole lot of governments actually do this, though. There are some kind of checks. Some negative sides to this, right? Some cons, if you will, to monetizing your debt. One, it devalues the currency. Right? If you are monetizing your debt, you're going to devalue your own currency, which is not necessarily a good thing. And it's also going to make them untrustworthy borrowers. Right? Which makes sense, right? Because if you just expect somebody to give you something worthless after you've lent them something, you're not going to lend that person anything again, right? If you have a friend and he asks to borrow $50, and then he goes and just prints off a shroot buck or whatever, and for $50 worth, and hands that to you, you're probably, and then refuses to actually give you real money, then you're probably not going to lend that person any money ever again, right? So those are the two big reasons why we don't see this terribly often. All right, but so those are the first two costs of inflation. That's what I was looking for. These are the first two costs of inflation. We will cover the last two in a separate video. All right, so I will see. So we're done with these two, and I'll see you guys in the next video.